our next watercolor painting, we are going to work on doing some pine trees. We're going to perfect our pine tree technique. We're also going to bring in the idea of the atmospheric perspective and bring it into a treescape. Before we get started, we're going to do a little warm up here on a piece of watercolor paper. And this is going to try to get some more control with your paintbrush. So I have a couple of my thin paintbrushes. Grab different sizes of your paintbrush, and what we're going to do is we're going to try to get some thin lines over here. We're just going to practice getting thin lines. So I'm going to get started. I'm just going to work with my blue. Just do this all with one color. So basically, start with pressing down hard. What does a thick line look like? Then I am going to try to just reduce that as I go through. Now, a lot of times these lines can be shaky when we're first getting started, so the more we do a little warm up, the better. So you can see I'm going thinner, thin, thinnest. So the more I go through, the more control I end up getting. This happens every single time I come back to my paper. I want to grab a paintbrush and just practice a little bit more. So I'm just going to go through and do this with my different brushes. This also helps you get to know which brush, you work with best. So I'm going to do the same thing. Start with the heavy line. Go towards some thin lines. So what we're going to look at now is how to paint a couple of different pine trees. So I'm going to do a couple different techniques. My first one here is going to repeat the technique that I showed you in my earlier class. They're all going to start with this nice thin line, and I'm just going to go with calling this the line technique. And I am going to get some paint down. And so that is simply going through and starting with our lines, building up our pines this way. Now these aren't clean and orderly. Remember, if we're trying to make something look like it really does in nature, we break up our patterns, we shift it around a little bit. So that it looks more like a natural tree, not a perfect triangle. Switch it up. So right now a lot of these are very perfect horizontal, so what I'm going to do is throw a couple that change up direction so it looks a little bit more natural. We want to throw some imperfection in there. That makes it have a more realistic look. So my next tree is going to be similar to this one, but I'm going to make it a little bit more bare. So I am gonna get that chunk of paint off there and gonna start with just a line. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start to build it up in patches. Let this tree be a little bit more bare. So when we start to create big landscapes, we want to show a variety of these trees to make it look more realistic. So some trees are a little bit more bare, like this one that I'm making. For our next tree, we are going to do a different technique. So instead of a straight across line, we're going to do a more curved line. So as a little zoom in, I'm going to be doing this over and over again, okay? So I'm gonna be doing a curved line for this tree. So I'm gonna start it the same way with my center line. And now I'm gonna go through and do these tiny little curves to build this tree out. So we're filling it in a similar way as our first tree. We're just changing that line up a little bit. So for our next tree, we're going to use the paint that builds up on our brush a little bit more to our advantage. When you make a mark with your brush and there's a lot of paint on it, it makes this little paint blob. So we're gonna use that to our advantage and make a tree out of it. Start with my center, and basically we're gonna do the same thing, build a pine tree up, but using that blob. I'm gonna start down here. So you're gonna see that the mark ends up being the same. So what I like to do is flip my brush around, and you want to hold it in that direction. So you see I'm like taking the brush and moving it down a little bit. So for this next pine tree, we are going to use the tip of our brush a little bit more. And we're gonna build up different branches. Basically, in a really close kind of zoomed in, I'm going to create a mark for a branch, but then use some dots around it to build up a little chunk of that branch. So that's like a zoomed in version of what I'm gonna do for this whole tree here. Okay. So I'm gonna just go through, kind of do my little dabbing here and create a little section. And now I'm gonna take my brush and use the tip. So this is creating a space for those little bristles of the pine trees. So for this next tree, I'm gonna do a little combo of the last two. I'm just gonna change the direction of the line a little bit. So I'm going in with my center line. And now I'm gonna kinda take that where I use the edge of the brush, thin it out as I go through, kind of making it more like a little swirl, and then I'm gonna go in with a couple dots here. So creating enough variation so it looks like the pine tree. So that means maybe sometimes one of these will go downward, in a downward direction, instead of always going upward. Remember, I kind of change how I apply the brush too. Sometimes they're all on a side, sometimes they go all the way across. Sometimes we fill this gap, sometimes we leave the gap. So now we've got 6 different kinds of pine trees that we can include in our pine tree scenes. So practice these techniques, see what feels good to you, and we're going to start to make them into a landscape scene.